Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at den Vater, dort, oben, which translates to God in heaven almighty. I'd like to apologize for missing yesterday's upload. I got really busy and I had an internet outage by the time I got home, so I wasn't able to work on the chorale because I didn't have access to my files online. But I'm going to be doing a double upload today, so be on the lookout for a second video if it hasn't already been uploaded by the time you're watching this one. This is a little bit of a longer chorale, really not too much to write home about. I'd say the last phrase harmonically has the most interesting character, but all in all it's a fairly straightforward chorale. It just looks very dense on the page, but I'm going to break it down. So let's just hop right into the analysis. No key signature. We start with C major. We end with C major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is C major. We have a lower suspension here in the bass as well before we get B, G, D, and G, which is 5, 6, G major over B. We then have A, C, E, and A. And where we might be tempted to call this a 2-chord, I think this E is an accented non-chord tone here, and really what we're looking at is F sharp, A, and C, which is F sharp diminished over A. That's 7, 6 of 5, and if I knew any better, I might say we were in the key of G major right now, but because this really looks more, I don't know, secondary in terms of its positioning, the fact that we don't see additional F sharps later in the phrase, it's a relatively short phrase as well. I think that really we're just tonicizing a 5-chord, and it's more coincidental that it's preceded by a 5-chord. Coincidentally, when we get the 5-chord on the other side of it, G, D, G, and B, this would be the equivalent of a 1, 6, 7, 6, 1 progression in the key of G major. So Bach does this from time to time, where he uses the 7 of the chord that's being tonicized on the other side of it to create that chord progression just in a secondary context. We then have E, C, G, and C, and where we might be tempted to call this 1, I think this B flat tells a different story. I think this is actually 5, 6 of 4, right? Because the B flat implies that maybe there's some dominance going on, and I would likely hedge my bets that this would resolve to some type of 4 chord, C major over E, but with this passing B flat. And it does go to a 4 chord, F, A, F, and C, F major, and then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C. This F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and a 4-1 progression in the cadence means that this is a plagal cadence. Looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, so we're looking for a point to modulate, and I think we pretty much modulate right out the gate here. We have C, C, G, and E. That's another tonic triad with the passing 7th, and I think this is actually where we modulate to the key of G. This is now our 4 chord. We see F sharps throughout the phrase moving forward now, so I think this is a pretty clear indication that we've modulated. So we have C, A, F sharp, and D. This is a pretty interesting phrase, actually. Check out what happens here. So we have a 5-4-2 chord, D7 over C, and we would expect that to resolve to some type of tonic triad in first inversion, which it does, right? B is a non-chord tone, this B is also a non-chord tone, and this G is a non-chord tone. But when we take the aggregate of everything that's happening on this offbeat, we have 1-6, G major over B. 5-4-2 going to 1-6 is a normative progression. And then the cool thing is what happens afterwards. We see 5-4-2 going to 1-6 with some frequency in Bach, actually quite a bit of frequency. But here we have B, G, E, and C. Another 4-2 chord, 4-4-2, and we would expect this to resolve to 7-6. And would you believe it, we actually resolve to 7-6. A, F sharp, A, and C. F sharp diminished over A, which is pretty cool, right? It's a testament to the fact that these 4-2 chords resolve pretty consistently in Bach, which is awesome from a analytical standpoint, because when you see patterns that re-emerge like this as consistently as 4-2 chords do, it's pretty exciting. It's just exciting because Bach is someone who has broken a lot of conventions with a lot of the chord progressions he uses, so seeing consistency is cool. But then we resolve to our 1 chord, which is what we would expect, G, G, D, and B. Sorry, the chord progression shifted over a little bit to the right because 7 chords always occupy a lot of real estate on the page. Neighbor tone in the alto, passing tone in the bass, and very, very briefly we get the tonic triad in first inversion here on the 16th notes. Not even sure it's worth analyzing, but to be consistent with other analyses I've done in the past, if there's an intact chord as a result of passing tones or basically if I see a subdivision and the chord is entirely intact when you look at it with the other static notes, I analyze it as an inversion. That's just something I've been tracking because Bach's a little inconsistent with that. It's a toss-up. C, G, E, and A is A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 6/5 chords, or more specifically 2 6/5 chords in cadential situations. C, G, E, and A, it's A minor 7 over C. And then we have D, G, A, and A. This is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. What's really being implied is this F sharp here, which would make this a D major chord. Very brief passing 7th in the alto before we cadence on G major, our tonic triad in root position. Now this next cadence is actually a little fascinating. To me it sounded like, well, it is an imperfect authentic cadence in terms of C, but this might be one of these subdominant imperfect authentic cadences that were actually quite common in my earlier videos, where Bach would just turn around and it would feel like we just spontaneously moved to the key of C without really setting it up. But after further listening to it, I think this F being suspended here in the alto objectively makes it a little weaker as a subdominant cadence, or a weaker argument for a subdominant cadence, just because the F gets introduced earlier. But it does sort of feel like we're in G and all of a sudden we're in the key of C. So I just want to bring that up. If you hear it differently, you can disregard this subdominant term. I don't know if there is terminology for cadencing on the 4 of the scale, if it's some type of half cadence because it's also a fifth away from the tonic. I don't know, but I've been calling it subdominant just because that's the chord that he chooses to cadence on, and it appears with regularity. We start the phrase off with E minor, E, B, E, and G. That's our 6th chord. E again, no need to mark that, it's a chord tone. Then we have E, B, E, and G, another 6th chord, no need to mark it. Passing 7th, or a delayed passing 7th in the bass. C, C, E, and A. Now this is an interesting one as well. Actually, I said that there isn't much to write home about, but there are these small little details that occur in this chorale in particular that make it, I guess, have little unique profile. So 6 wants to go to 2 here, but we have this case where E and F sharp occur in one of the voices, which puts us in a bind because when we're trying to assign a chord to this and only one voice is moving, it doesn't really feel like a chord progression is happening if we're moving one voice. That's just my opinion. I feel like 2 voices moving, that's a compelling argument that a chord progression is happening, but one voice, I feel like really the chord is switching rather than being progressed from one to another. So I think 2/6 is a valid analysis here, and that would imply that we would actually have a 2-to-1 progression here. But I actually hear this E as a accented non-chord tone, and it's this F sharp here that turns this into a 7/6/4 chord. And I think the big picture is that we have 6 going to 7, going to 1/6, B, D, G, and B. But of course, 7/6 versus 7/6/4 versus 2/6, I think they're fairly interchangeable in this context. It's not necessarily a dominant going to a tonic here. I think it's just 2 passing chords, but with the leading tone being present, it feels a little bit more like a diminished chord to me. That's just how I've trained myself to hear it, and it seems fairly consistent with how Bach has composed in the chorales we've looked at previously. So consistent with my previous analyses, and also just based on my relationship with the harmony. But if you see that as a 2 chord, I think it's totally valid as well. If you see this as a 2/7 progression, I think that's totally valid as well. This is just my take on it. 1/6 takes us to A, C, G, and C. I think this G is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and it's really F A and C, which might lead us to believe that this G major chord in first inversion is actually 5-6 in the key of C, and this is a deceptive progression of sorts, as F major in first inversion would not be the most likely destination for a 5 chord, especially so close to a cadence. It's like 5 we would expect maybe to take us to a tonic, but here it's being used as a pivot to turn around that will eventually lead us to the tonic. So afterwards we have B, D, F, and G. That's G7 over B, 5-6-5. G is a chord tone, E is not, D is a chord tone, and then we cadence on C, 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 E, and G. So this F natural here kind of insinuates the F chord on the third beat, or sorry, on the first beat of this 3-beat cadence, which makes this feel a little less subdominant in nature, but Bach was using chromaticism in the cadences beforehand, and it didn't have that same impact on the cadence. This one just sort of feels, even though it has the profile of a authentic cadence, it feels plagal because of that F being so prevalent in the alto. Just my thoughts. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. But moving ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. No modulations in this phrase, we're just staying in the key of C. F, C, F, and A is our 4 chord, F major, passing 7th in the alto, F, D, D, and G, sorry, F, B, D, and G. That is another 5-4-2 chord like we saw earlier, and we typically know where this is going to resolve to 1-6. We have E, C, and E here. This B and this D are chord tones, so we don't need to mark them, but E, C, E, and G spells C major in first inversion. We then have E, A, C, and F. That's another F major 7 chord in third inversion, 5-4-2, and we know where this is going to resolve. This is actually quite similar to the phrase that we saw after our first phrase, our second phrase. This B is a non-chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone, and this B is a non-chord tone, leaving us with 7-6, B diminished over D. So here we saw it in the context of G major, here we're seeing it in the context of C major, and this 7-6 chord is resolving to 1, C, G, C, and E. This D is a passing tone, this F is a neighbor tone, this E, G, C, and E, it's basically a transposition or a reinterpretation of what's going on in this phrase here. I don't think the phrases are identical to one another, but they are similar enough to be considered counterparts to one another, I would say. So if you were doing a formal analysis and we had this as an A, this was a B, very clear that this is a B prime for sure. 1-6, very, very briefly, it's happening on a 16th note, potentially the weakest beat in the entire phrase, or in the entire measure rather, sorry. We get taken to F, F, A, C, and, sorry, D, D minor 7 over F. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. In cadential situations especially, D and F are chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. G, D, C, and D. The C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but we know it's being implied as G major, which is our 5 chord. A little passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on C major, C, E, G, and C, which is our tonic in root position. And we are on our last sort of leg for this particular chorale. We're looking at the second half, which consists of a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. We start things off with C, C, E, G, and C, so we don't need to reanalyze in the key of C major, but this could be the beginning of the, or this could be a part of the window where we have a modulation between the key of C major and G major. You could say the phrase starts in G major, but I think similarly to how the first phrase is sort of proportioned and how the harmonies are fitting with one another, I think we're going to modulate to G over this G chord. So here we're not quite getting a modulation, but we're getting a tonicization that's maybe a step beyond our average, where we are not just tonicizing a chord, but we're preceding the tonicization with the chord that is also being tonicized, which might even constitute a modulation to some people. But to me, I don't really think it's enough. I think context matters, and in this context, we're moving to the key of G because we see F sharps later and we cadence on a G major chord. So we're looking for a point to modulate, and I think it's over this G major chord, B, D, G, and B. The C is a lower suspension, so this would be a 5-6 chord in the key of C major and a 1-6 chord in the key of G major. We then have E, G, G, and C. I don't think this is a 4-6. Actually, you know what? No, this is a 4-6 chord, and the reason why this is a 4-6 chord is because 4-6 going to 7 is a very common subdivided chord progression for Bach, and that's exactly what happens. We have E, A, E, A, F sharp, and C, which is 7, 4, 3, F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over E. 4 going to 7, like I said, is a very common subdivided progression in Bach, and we would expect that to resolve to our tonic in whatever inversion. Either the 4-3 chords are sort of a ringer because they could resolve up or down. In this case, we are resolving down, D, B, G, and B. Kind of interesting to see our chord in second inversion here, but remember our tonic, I don't know why I put a parentheses there, our tonic is just being inverted this way because it's part of a passing configuration. And of course with Bach, with second inversion triads, it's not always a done deal that they have to be part of a passing figure or part of a pedal figure where they're sharing the same bass like we have here, second inversion, because the bass is being kept constant, or part of a cadential situation. It just is a trend. It's just something that happens relatively commonly in the music. But this C is a passing tone. This D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get A minor 7 over C, C, E, G, and A, 2, 6, 5. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential situations. The C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. D, A, F sharp, and A is our 5 chord, D major. D is a chord tone. C is a little passing 7th here before we cadence on G major, G, B, G, and G. 3 roots, 1/3, 2, 5, 1 progression. The most common cadence that we've had so far in the chorale. Our penultimate phrase has an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. Sorry, imperfect authentic has to make its way into the staff here, but it just so happens that there's not enough of a gutter or a margin in between the two systems. But yeah, we're looking for a point to modulate, and I'm fairly convinced that we're modulating right off the bat here, and that this G major chord is actually our 5 chord in the key of C major as well. And this is pretty clear because we have F natural as this passing tone immediately afterwards, and there's no evidence of F sharps in the next phrase as well. So we have one of these elided modulations where the next key is already set in stone by the function of the shared function of the chord that we cadenced on. And this is a common device that Bach uses. He typically modulates at the beginning of the phrase and then continues in that same key until the end of the phrase. Of course, this isn't always the case, but it's the general trend. He'll start as early as the chord that we cadence on, and he'll stay in that key. And this phrase is true in that regard. So G major going to C major, C, C, E, and G. It's our tonic triad. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, E, C, G, and G. That's our tonic triad in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral here, just redo the figured bass. F, C, G, and A. A little bit of counterpoint here. I'm going to analyze this just as a plain old 4 chord. G is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. By the time we resolve down though, F is over E, so maybe 5/4/2 would be more appropriate, especially because of the fact that we are going to a 7/6 chord on the next beat. So I will analyze this as a 5/4/2 chord, but it is sort of contrapuntal, and I think that 4 is a sufficient analysis as well, because in contrapuntal situations there's like a curving or a blurring of the harmonic, where exactly the harmonic rhythm or the beat is happening. Like, where do we draw the line between where we pull the chord out of the texture and where we define the harmonic rhythm? Because the melody is static, the tenor is static in this case too, but the bass and the alto add a little bit of variety. So this resolves to 7/6, like I just said, D, D, F, and B. B diminished over D. So we see 4-2 resolving the way we would expect it to. And that takes us to C, G, F, and C. This F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This is our tonic and root position. And then we have C, G, D, and G. This G is a chord tone, this D is a chord tone, this G is a chord tone, this C is a lower suspension, and this B is actually our chord tone here. It's a 5-6 chord, G major over B. This F is a very brief passing seventh before we get C major. Another interesting imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major here, akin to our third phrase, which has a little bit more interesting of a profile, the third phrase does, that is, but we see that we have another imperfect authentic cadence with the fifth of the chord and the melody. Now this isn't a rule, but generally speaking, imperfect authentic cadences in the chorales typically consist of the third of the chord and the melody rather than the fifth. The fifth is typically associated with the half cadence. Neither of those are set in stone. I don't have the data or the exact percentage of when we see the fifth of the chord and the melody in a half cadence and when we see the third of the chord of the melody in an imperfect authentic cadence, but I could say for certain that it is something that happens more often than not. So when we see an imperfect authentic cadence with the fifth of the chord and the melody, it's not too much to write home about, but it is interesting enough to point out, so that's why I take time to mention it, especially when, you know, I've spent as much time as I have looking at the chorales. Little things like this tend to stick out, have their own unique little quirks about them. But we are closing in on our final cadence. We actually got through this chorale content-wise. There's a lot of content here, but we're getting through it very, very quickly. There might be an argument for this last phrase that we move very briefly to the key of like one flat, like either F or D minor here, but I think we overall stay in the key of C major. The melody really drives that home. The bass doesn't really do too much to, I guess, convey the idea, but B flat and the way that the chords resolve does feel very F major, D minor like, and you'll see what I mean. F, C, C, and F, F, C, and A. Sorry, that's a 4 chord, F major. F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. C, G, F, and G. This F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. But look what we have here. We have another B flat, very similar to the B flat we saw in our first phrase, which makes me feel like we might have a 5 of 4 situation going on as opposed to a tonic situation. I feel like tonic is a valid analysis here, and this B flat could just be a chromatic passing tone, but I feel like the chromatic passing tone always has some type of implication on the harmony. It never really has proven otherwise, at least in recent memory, but the vast majority of the time this is implying that we're moving somewhere pertinent to 4. In this case, we're not moving exactly to 4, we're moving to D minor, D, A, E, and F. And wouldn't you believe it, the D minor chord that we see in the middle of the phrase here has a 9/8 suspension over the bass, which is something that Bach typically does with D minor chords. I don't know why this 9/8 suspension is seen so frequently in the alto, but even in pieces that aren't in the key of D minor, we see the suspension used with D minor chords. It's just something that Bach must have enjoyed. It's a pretty cool, neat little Easter egg that I've noticed in the chorales. But we go to D minor, which is a 6 chord, sorry, I was thinking in terms of F here. This is a 2 chord, and this would be an example of a secondary deceptive progression, right? 5 of 4 is a C major chord. That would be like 5 going to 6 in the key of F major. This would be like a 1-5-6 progression in the key of F major, but here we have 4, 5 of 4, 2, which is just a roundabout way of implying that exact same thing. So secondary dominants don't typically, or they typically resolve where we would expect them to, but they don't necessarily resolve where we expect them to. In this case, that's proving the latter. It's not resolving where we would expect it to. But I think even more interesting than this secondary deceptive progression is what happens next. We get like this really modal progression here. We have A, C, and E. So for starters, 2 going to 6 is sort of the inverse of a normative progression, right? We would expect 6 to go to 2, but this is an example of a transitive, or what I've been calling a transitive progression, because if 6 can go to 2, 2 can very easily go to 6, and it'll just approach the dominant from a different angle, right? 6 can just as easily go to 5, but in this case, 6 with this passing 7th in the bass takes us right back to 2. F, A, C, and D, more specifically 2, 6, 5. So 2 going to 6 going to 2 is sort of like a 1, 5, 1, but the A would be like our minor dominant here. So if this were a C sharp, I think we would have perhaps modulated to the key of D minor for a little bit. I mean, there'd be an argument to be made for sure, like a 3, 7, 1 progression or something like that. But all in all, it's interesting that Bach is able to keep C major in the in just the conscience, while also basically avoiding C major chords in any type of tonic function. Like the only C major chord we see is secondary dominant, or at least what I view as a secondary dominant. But the chorale ends the way we would expect. 2, 6, 5. This B is a chord tone. This D is a chord tone. Wait, no, this is a D. No, this B is a non-chord tone. This D is a chord tone. This A is a chord tone. Sorry, I was thinking in terms I was looking for like a G major chord or something, which is going to come next. G, D, B, and D, which is our 5 chord G major. This G is a chord tone. This F is a little passing 7th. And then we cadence on C major, C, E, G, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position. Perfect authentic cadence, just like we would expect a chorale to end. And that is the analysis of this chorale. All in all, a couple of interesting things. This cadence still sounds very interesting to me. I'm going to keep it as a subdominant imperfect authentic cadence in my notes because they don't come up too frequently anymore. They were definitely a lot more common in the first like 100 or so chorales. I don't know what was going on in his cantatas. Maybe just the melodic material suited it a little bit better. Who knows? All in all, imperfect authentic cadence that has a subdominant twist to it. It's pretty interesting. This last chord progression is pretty interesting as well. All the modulations in this chorale are fairly straightforward. They're all common chord, and they all pretty much, once he modulates, he stays in the key until he modulates at the beginning of the next phrase, if he does modulate in the next phrase. And all the 4/2 chords resolving the way that we would expect is exciting as well, because, you know, there was a chorale not too long ago, might have even been our last chorale, where we saw 4/2 chords resolve to a root position triad, which is uncommon, but it's explainable, right? The bass still resolves the way we would expect, but it's part of a longer figure, bigger picture. But like I said, really not too many super exciting things about this chorale. Relatively quaint and straightforward with the harmony. And that's how I'm going to end the video. So if you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.